think we're set. Um, because I know some of the story, I'm going to ask you just to tell some pieces of your story.
Mm-hmm.
Would you give some? First of all, look at the camera. If I move around because I want to adjust the light or something, try and ignore me and just talk to the camera. I would like to ask you to tell about your growing up. And growing up, I know the story of who one of your playmates was the son of the mafia don, and you had a pretty rough and a pretty non-Peace Corps childhood. And one of the reasons I want to collect that story is the gentleman, one of the fellows who spoke at the Peace Corps of South Florida annual meeting was working with Shriver and others, and they said they realized that they made a mistake by getting people who were the BMOCs and big men on campus, and in fact wanted your childhood was exactly what they wanted, because you were street smart and capable and problem solving and didn't need a lot of could create your own structure and solve your own problems. So that's why I'm sort of asking that question and leaving that. So if you would, Jack, tell us something about your childhood and growing up and before you went in your mother's message to you, and then the fact that she thought you should do something good, I think was the expression.
Yeah, I guess my story begins in Pittsburgh. I'm the last of 11 children. My father was killed when I was 2 years old in an automobile accident, so we had gone from solid middle income to lower middle class at least, and it was a frightening time, I think, for my mother. And Pittsburgh, which was the major supplier of steel in World War II to the point where it produced 3/4 of the world's steel from 1938 to 45. Pittsburgh was a tough place, dirty place. Really, the smog in the air was immense. But it was also a family town, and my family did well because of my mother's strength and character. So I think all in all, what happens when your father dies like that, you sort of, my brother and I raised each other, really. And I'm proud of that. I grew up in a tough way. You had to fight, you had to make your way. But it also taught you a lot. It taught you how to defend yourself, how to not be bullied, and I was born with dyslexia, a crossed eye. Other kids were not very nice to kids with problems like that. So I had to learn to defend myself, and I did. And I think the love of my mother, who was awfully good to us 11 children, saved us all, really. We were saved by one woman, our mother. And she taught us a sense of justice in the world. We came from miners in eastern Pennsylvania. I had an uncle killed in the mines in 1953. We were union people. My father was a self-made metallurgist in the steel mill before he died. So there was this combination of lower middle class, trying to aspire like the rest of America was, going up in the world. And my mom was a school teacher when she was young. So I think the experience of Pittsburgh prepared me for life because it allowed me a lot of room to grow. I liked the room. A lot of kids might not like all that kind of room, but my brother and I did. We went everywhere. We did everything ourselves. We fought back. We were Catholics, so Protestants tried to bother us. We gave it right back. And it was a difficult time between Catholics and Protestants in our neighborhood. And so sometimes we'd be pushed out of the pictures on Easter Day. And it was there's even some strange Nazis in the neighborhood hung out flags in World War II, pro-German. But it was a nice way to grow up because you got to see a lot. And so I get to grade school, I did okay. I got to high school, I flunked everything in my sophomore year. I flunked every subject, including the gym. Even the coaches hated me. And my mom found my report card that I had failed everything. And she said to me, Jackie, you're either going to prison or military school or the seminary. And lo and behold, I chose the seminary, which really meant that I really was in a military school as well as a prison. So she got all three. I didn't know it. She was pretty clever. So the seminary was good to me. I learned to get over my temper, stop fighting. Instead of talking about who caught what pass, we talked about Aristotle and St. Thomas and Plato and great writers, and I became a reasonably educated person, and the seminary was very good for me. It was a nice place to go, and I liked it a lot. And I was ordained in 1966. I was a civil rights priest and anti-war priest for about 3-4 years. Got sort of bored with the job of the priest, although I liked it and respected it, still Catholic. I just got bored with that, and I wanted to continue my activity. I wanted to be an activist, not just praying an activist. I wanted to be a complete activist. So I thought if I'm going to be a maverick in the Catholic Church, I might as well go do that on my own. So I left that.
Mm-hmm. When you left the Catholic Church, was that when you went into the Peace Corps?
Now, my Peace Corps experience, which
I
loved.
You can kind of fill in the gap between.
What really happened was I left in 1968. I became the director of Young World Development, which was an arm of the Freedom from Hunger campaign, a food agriculture organization in Rome. We were a national body. I took it over. There was already the semblance of a new technique to raise money, and essentially I and a lot of young kids turned that activity into what is now called the Walkathon. We nationalized that idea in 1968, 69, 70. We raised about $12 to $15 million for world hunger. My board of directors was average 16 years old, and we did all that. We had over 300 marches across the country in 70 and 71. We raised, as I said, about 12 to 15 million, and it was a phenomenon. It really is amazing. So the rest of the world, the rest of the United States caught on to that technique and use it today.
What was the technique during the marches?
We taught people how to walk long distances and raise money. We started. Our marches were 28 miles, not these simple little 5-mile things. We were 12-mile things. We were 28 to 32 miles, and our difference was we were a lot smarter than what they do today. Today they just advertise on television and give it a big coffer. We let our local people in each walk, say there was a walk in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the kids in Milwaukee, Wisconsin would decide where the money went to fight world hunger. We helped them do that, we transfer the money and all that, but we allowed local decision making, and we would go into every high school and grade school in Milwaukee and give a talk. We organized it at a very, very base level, and we were very successful. In Chicago, we had 125,000 marchers. In Buffalo, we had 105,000 marches. Probably every kid in Buffalo was in that march. So we were very successful. Then I went on. I worked for Dick Gregory, the comedian, about world hunger, and I convinced him, it didn't take a lot, Dick and I decided he should run across the United States for world hunger. And so we did that in 1976. He won the Dawson Award, the Black Caucus, won a lot of awards. We ended up July 4th in the bicentennial entering New York City. Very successful. I went into the Peace Corps with Dick Gregory to see if they would hire John Lewis at a very high level of the organization. John Lewis is probably the second greatest man in the civil rights movement behind Dr. King. I mean, he's like a saint. He's a wonderful guy. He's now a congressman in Atlanta. Anyway, Dick and I go into the building to convince the leadership there to bring John into the leadership, and they agreed. There was no problem with that. And they said to me on the way out, "Why don't you join us here?" And I said, "I don't want to be a bureaucrat in Washington." And they said, "Well, maybe you think about Peace Corps then." And I said, "Well, I will. I'll take a look." So in that process, I saw that the job of the Peace Corps director in Lesotho was available. And I immediately went for that because I saw that I could have a government job, get paid, and which was important because they hadn't really been paid up to that time much at all, that I could go to Lesotho, and while being a good Peace Corps director, I could fight apartheid while I was there, because Lesotho is completely surrounded by South Africa, about 5 hours driving time south of Johannesburg. And I saw that I could continue my civil rights work, which had begun way back with Dr. King in 1962. And we had helped organize the March on Washington and then passage of the Civil Rights Bill, so I was happy to continue that kind of work. And if you see Lesotho at that time, it's in the belly of what we called the Beast, which was apartheid state, which ruled against blacks in favor of the white minority, which has now changed. It changed in the 90s with Dr. Mandela coming out of jail. But we were still in the dark period. And so I went down there to do both, really. And when I got there, along with the Peace Corps directors in Botswana and Swaziland.
Can I get you to back up for a second?
Yeah.
Because you didn't go in just as a volunteer. You went in as a director. Can you kind of clarify that?
Yeah, in the process of the Peace Corps, I did not enter the Peace Corps as a volunteer. I entered as a staff director, and I had my choice of a number of countries, but I picked Lesotho. That's the one I really wanted. And I was President Carter had to sign off at that time. It was a presidential appointment at that time, and that was really nice. I was really excited about going there. And from about 1977 to 1981, when I was there, I would have about 80 to 120 volunteers at any given time. And it was a mountain kingdom. We were above 5,000 feet, so above a mile above sea level, to 10,000 feet the country was. Most of the country was rural, and it lived in a fertile crescent, which was on the edge of South Africa. So most of the people up and down the Fertile Crescent, including our volunteers, would automatically go across the border where they were and shop. So all the way up and down that Fertile Crescent, that's where almost all the people lived. That's where my volunteers worked. They worked as help farming, help agriculture, small business, teachers. They did a lot of good work. I had a great number of volunteers, and they were all really terrific. And so automatically, if you look at that Fertile Crescent, they automatically would go to South Africa to shop instead of come down that long road, which was dangerous anyway. They would go across into South Africa, shop, go back into Lesotho. Everybody did that, all up along that Fertile Crescent. And so among our volunteers, of course, were a number of people who were of color, dark, like Greeks or Asian or anybody dark, black, brown. You didn't know when you went into South Africa whether you'd be seen as black or white or colored. You had no idea, and that was a revolving lottery every day. I mean, and literally people in South Africa go from dark to white, depending upon who was making the decision. So it was always a completely arbitrary system. And our problem as Peace Corps directors, both in Swaziland and in Botswana, because the volunteers would automatically, on their free time, go to South Africa, beautiful country. They want to see the animals, travel it, see Cape Town. It's a magnificent country. They wanted to go there and see it on their spare time. Well, they were traveling in an apartheid state. So our volunteers who are black, brown, light brown, whatever, anybody of color would run the risk of running into apartheid. So if a black and white couple, for instance, volunteers who are dating or not dating or just traveling together, would go to a hotel, they would put the white in a nice place and the black would be, who knows, maybe it couldn't be at a place. They'd try to put them in a chicken coop. It was terrible. So also, if one of our volunteers got hurt, seriously hurt, which it can occur in combis, on motorcycles, falling from the mountain, then we directors had to take care of them, of course, and look out for them. But we couldn't send them into South Africa because if they were black, brown, or light brown, they might be put into a black hospital, which at that time did not have the full capacity of the white hospitals and the proper care that, you know, the white minority got and the black majority did not get in medical help. We were worried that they would not be taken care of properly, and we wanted them in the white hospital, not because it was white, but because there's better health care there and they'd be really taken care of. So if our volunteer was seriously hurt, we had to bring a jet down from Frankfurt to pick them up and take them back. And that's 10-hour flight, 12-hour flight. So we had this big problem of how do we train all the Americans, because we Americans deal with all Americans. We don't deal with individual, color and all that sort of thing. We didn't have apartheid. So how do you prepare volunteers to travel in South Africa became a question as well. It's not only worrying about their health. If something happened, what was our strategy to get our volunteers to the best possible care? That was the first problem. That could happen at any moment. We also had to prepare them just to travel in South Africa because of apartheid, because they could be separated out. The police could start hassling you. It was difficult. And in places whites could get in, blacks couldn't get in. It was tremendous discrimination within South Africa about color. And our volunteers were not like that. They might get into a hassle, might argue with the police. They weren't prepared for that experience. They'd get an awful lot of trouble. So the director in Swaziland, his name is Reg Petty. He was a great guy out of the civil rights movement, had been in the Mississippi Freedom Rides, marvelous human being, and I had tremendous respect for him. Norm and Elsa Rush were a couple who ran Botswana Peace Corps. Norman is now one of the best writers in the United States. He's a magnificent writer. He had spent 4 years in jail for conscientious objection as an atheist in the Korean War. So he had a long history of conscientious objection and effective activism, as did his wife, Elsa. Wonderful people. We would get together and try to figure out how do we deal with the training issue, preparing our volunteers to travel in South Africa as black, white, and browns. And there was one Greek girl, she not that she thought she was white, but when she was challenged as being black, she thought she's been white all her life. All of a sudden she was black. She didn't know. These kind of things occurred all the time. So we needed to set up a training program for our volunteers, for all of them, because white people would be traveling with black or brown or light brown people. They had to be prepared too for the situation because it could get difficult. And then they'd stand up for whoever they were traveling with. So we had set up a training program that became very controversial. And we set up health processes where if anybody got hurt, we would rally to get the best possible care for them and travel with them and stay with them. We directors, or a deputy director, would stay with a volunteer to make sure that if we took them to a white hospital and they happened to be black, brown, yellow. Because even among, I hate to talk about these colors, but that's the way it was. Japanese were white people in South Africa. Chinese were black people. Believe it or not, this all is actually.
Yeah. I have to ask you because it's okay.
So
it's another 5 minutes left on this card, and we'll switch off.
So we three directors, the Russians in Botswana, Reg Petty in Swaziland, me, Jack Healey, and Lesotho, we'd get together and formulate a training program, and what we did if we ever had anybody really hurt, what would we do? We set up processes for that.
What was the worst thing that ever happened to a volunteer that was over there?
They would be separated out.
Mm-hmm.
If they went to a hotel, a black couldn't get in, and a white would get a nice room. And then
were they ever jailed, or did they ever?
Well, then they'd have to go back home. They were thinking, what do you do? How do you handle that? So they sleep out, because the volunteers would stick together, of course, and travel together. It's not an easy situation. So within the training program that we set up, it caused a lot of problems because we would hire people who knew South Africa, and that was primarily the citizens of South Africa who knew it and how to deal with the situation. So we would hire African National Congress people, which the United States government at the time did not support, thought they were communists, and did not like us hiring them, didn't want them to hire those kind of people. But they were the only people who knew how to travel in South Africa, how to handle the situation, what was the history of apartheid, and how to deal with it as an intellectual economic system, and many of the ambassadors, including my own, had difficulty with all that training program. But luckily for us, the Peace Corps in Washington supported us. Governor Celeste, who later became governor in Ohio, I think, supported us totally. Congress supported us eventually. We got challenged a lot by ambassadors, and by certain Senator Helms challenged letters to us. He sent us letters. What are we doing out there with these communists and so on? We answered them. We stood by our training program and how to handle these health issues, because no one could answer the health issue. What do you do if someone really got hurt or needed an immediate operation, and they happened to be of color? So luckily, I don't think any of us had to deal. I don't think anybody got hurt that we know of that didn't get treated appropriately, because we'd look out for that and find ahead of time some good doctors and have an alternative strategy to do that. But if we didn't do that, we'd have looked like we were idiots, and we felt, all three of us felt, I think I can speak for the others, that we had to set up our own system to deal with apartheid, of which the United States did support South Africa, and we directors did not support South African apartheid. We didn't like it, and we didn't want to deal with it unless we had to. And so I think our volunteers handled it very well. They did the training programs. We hired the African National Congress people. We paid them as you would any other trainer, and the Peace Corps Washington backed us up. They turned it into a training program they put into the Peace Corps paper at the time, and all up and down the Peace Corps, they stood by our volunteers, and the three of us directors down there in Southern Africa, they stood by us and backed us up. So it was really a nice experience, although we got a lot of heat from Congress and a lot of complaints from the ambassadors. We stood by our volunteers, and they did a good job. We got through at least my 4.5 years as a Peace Corps director in Lesotho. We didn't get fired.
All right. Okay. I mean, how did let's take that experience and what you learned in the Peace Corps. Did you come back? Is that when you went with Amnesty? What lessons did you learn in the Peace Corps, both personally in terms of direction as to what you want to do with your life, and then skills that you've been honing in terms of?
I guess my Peace Corps experience in Lesotho prepared me for the job that I eventually got at Amnesty International. I knew there's political oppression in the country. We'd find bodies on the road who had been killed in a political battle. I got to see an apartheid state up close and worked for 4.5 years as best I could to bring an end to it. The young kids who came over from South Africa as refugees, most of them have been tortured or beat up or been in jail for a long time. So I became quite familiar with extrajudicial executions, with the pursuit of police about refugees in Lesotho, the SWAT teams that come in from South Africa, blow up houses and rondavels where most of Africans live in Lesotho. They throw a satchel of explosives in there to kill people from the African National Congress. It gave me an on-ground experience with apartheid and oppression and how people are dealt badly by government and what oppression can mean on a daily basis, as well as in Lesotho. So in some sense, when I answered the one ad, I saw an ad up on the volunteers, where the volunteers they'd post jobs, so when they were going back, they could get one. I saw this job one day, Director of Amnesty. I answered it. I never thought I'd hear from them, but I did, and eventually ended up with the job. And really, I had an on-ground experience in Lesotho of not only of oppression of South Africa and Lesotho on its citizens, I also had experience in the development field how, when the West decides to do something for third world people, it seldomly works. It really is, you have to see the experience of a volunteer, I think, in working at the very grassroots level, how hard it is to help anybody in another country, and what's the best experience. I always felt that the best part of American foreign policy in Lesotho was Peace Corps. Not the roads, not the houses they built, all the money that came into the wheat fields and all the different kinds of agriculture and business. I just felt Peace Corps was the best because we promised little, we delivered 100% of what we promised. And nothing else in the American foreign policy delivered that. They really always somehow messed it up. They'd put $1 million into a wheat area. Next year you come and there'd just be abandoned tractors or something. But the Peace Corps delivered. You wanted a teacher, we got you a teacher. The teacher taught for 2 years, never messed with the kids, showed up on time, and all their mothers and dads were glad you had a Peace Corps volunteer in the school because it sort of helped discipline and help it out. The Peace Corps did a phenomenal job in Lesotho. And it prepared me on the level of working with young people, working with development issues, on making sure the answers should be African. If it's for Africa, the answers have to be African, not Western, not American. And I think, in a sense, I got to see oppression up close of what South Africa was doing to its own people. And so when I got the job at Amnesty International, I had a pretty clear perspective of what goes on in those prisons, what goes on in the torture chamber, how many people are killed, and how devastating it is for people caught up in a system like that. So it prepared me for my job, I think, very well. I was really pleased about that.
Other than going back to your Peace Corps experience and not liking apartheid and wanting to fight it, did you and any of the Peace Corps volunteers do things to actively fight it, or was it just what I would call just by not being bowed by it, or
well, I think in some sense the Peace Corps volunteers got to see apartheid, so they came back to the United States and would spread the word about how bad apartheid is and how it is on a daily basis for the citizens of South Africa. I think it was helpful. I think also apartheid allows you, at that time our volunteers would see it up close, it allows you to decide about basic integrity in the system, because in the United States we still had our problems between black and whites. And so I think it raised their consciousness of how important that issue is, that we should dialogue, we should get along, we Americans got to do better. And I think they went back to be better citizens because they saw when it went wrong, it really went wrong. So I think they had their consciousness raised, not only in South Africa, but coming back home as well, which is part of the responsibility of a Peace Corps volunteer.
Were Peace Corps volunteers allowed to protest or do anything active politically, or did you keep them from doing that?
No, what Peace Corps volunteers did, they were on their own. They did what they wanted to do. You know, they're really there on their own, and we don't tell them what to do. They don't tell us what to do. It's a pretty free thing for them because they're Americans doing what they want. They're volunteers, so they can do what they want. But within Lesotho, our volunteers would help with the refugees who are in country. They give their T-shirts. Doesn't sound like much, but it is. They give clothes. They'd just be friends with the refugees, which was important. And they'd talk about the United States. There'd be dialogue. Sometimes the volunteers would go to meetings at the African National Congress just to hear what it was all about and get their consciousness raised. One day, right after I got there in 1977, the South Africans blew up a house, and our Peace Corps volunteer lived next door. Her name was Faith Merrick. She was a nurse. She went over and helped them in that struggle. We'd provide food sometimes to the hospital because inside the Lesotho hospitals they didn't provide much good food when you're trying to recuperate. We'd deliver food to the African National Congress refugees. And at times, as best we could, we would provide friendship, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're in a struggle, you're in a foreign country by yourself, which Lesotho was to South Africans, friendship and just talking things over is terribly important to do. It really encourages them. And our volunteers would do a very good job of that. They were very sensitive, and they were good at their work, and they were good at friendship. And having Americans in Lesotho spread across the country, being decent, honorable people, was a magnificent statement by the American people that we were against apartheid, and these kids, black, white, red, or blue, whatever they were, really were good volunteers and a good example to people of South Africa how integration can work rather than that apartheid system.
Have you kept in touch with many people from your days in Africa?
Yeah, the Lesotho volunteers are very well organized, and thank God some of them are from my period, 77 to 81. They do it on their own, of course, but they're very good at organizing. They meet regularly. I haven't got to the meetings, but we donate regularly, all of us, to a fund to help in schools or agriculture or whatever. We do projects with the Lesotho government on an ongoing basis every year. We donate a certain amount of money. And
do you have friends over in Lesotho still?
Sure. But Timby Bekepi, my secretary, is a very interesting lady. She spoke, I think, 6, 7 languages all at one time. Never saw a book in her life. Books 6, 7 pages. Amazing talent. Yeah, I missed them all. I liked my staff in the Peace Corps of Lesotho. The host country nationals were tremendous people and helped this dumb director from the United States do a reasonably good job. Oh God!
When you got to Amnesty, were you able to help your friends in the ANC and others, or worse?
Yeah, I mean,
so it's kind of like you could continue that.
Well, the Peace Corps experience in Southern Africa, because I traveled a lot. I went to Zimbabwe when it was Rhodesia, then it became Zimbabwe. I went to Southwest Africa, it became Namibia. I visited Mozambique, which at that time was a communist state. I got familiar with all of Southern Africa. So, as a director of Amnesty International, if things were occurring, and we had campaigns in Southern Africa, I sort of knew what to do and how to do it, the way to go about it, and how to be sensitive to those issues. I had to learn other parts of the world the same way, but I was particularly good in those areas. And we did a magnificent passport campaign against the South Africans that worked very well. And that came from that experience of a Peace Corps director. Yeah. It was a great period for me. It was a wonderful period. I also got paid. It was really nice to get paid for the first time.
We came back with Amnesty, and you were with Amnesty for 14 years?
12.
12 years? Okay. When you did the concerts for peace, did that have any roots, any thinking that was rooted in your Peace Corps experience, or was it just?
Yeah, my Peace Corps experience helped me with the world tour I did. We played 16 countries in 6 weeks with Bruce Springsteen, Sting, Peter Gabriel, Tracy Chapman, Youssou N'Dour, and we played on all the continents of the world. And we had 2 DC-10s, and we did that within 6 weeks. And what I want to do is go to South Africa or get as close to as I possibly could. So we negotiated with Zimbabwe to play in that big stadium in Zimbabwe. We had to essentially train our own promoter. We had to invent a promoter because the stadium was massive. It was built by the Chinese, which meant there were wide entrances. And, it's hard to crowd control, all that sort of thing occurs. But the reason we played Zimbabwe is because of my Peace Corps experience. And, up till that time for Amnesty International, we were not allowed into Zimbabwe, but that tour was allowed to come into Zimbabwe. And so, and part of that is because of my contacts in Southern Africa. Phyllis Naidu, who was then an African National Congress leader, living in Zimbabwe, being protected by the Zimbabwean government because the South Africans wanted to execute her for whatever reason. That's the reason we went down there. We had those contacts and I could work them out. It was because of Peace Corps that we played Zimbabwe. And all of our musicians who had never been down there got to see Southern Africa and the apartheid. A lot of their soldiers came to that concert. The white South African soldiers came to that concert. And so the whole front row, which we thought was going to be black, was actually white because they bought the tickets the earliest, camped out earlier. And Bruce Springsteen spoke to them personally from the stage about apartheid, how they shouldn't fight their own people. And they were South African soldiers. There were thousands of them there. And that was a very good thing to do by Bruce. And it was an unusual moment. At a concert where they came to see their hero, and here he was telling them not to fight their own people. It was quite a poignant moment.
What are some of the poignant moments that you think about back when you were there in the Peace Corps? Was there any one most memorable experience or most satisfying experience when there was a breakthrough of some sort?
My Peace Corps experience gave me many valuable relationships. One was Chris Hani, the military leader of the African National Congress, was a neighbor of mine. Later, he was executed right after independence. Chris probably had the largest funeral in the history of Africa. Brilliant young man. More likely to talk to me about Chesterton and Belloc, so I'd have to go home and read about the people I'm supposed to know, people want to know about. But he was a magnificent young man who would have been the Prime Minister of South Africa. Got to know him well. Got to know Dennis Cooney, one of the lawyers of Mandela, Winnie, and Nelson, who defended them for years, all the way back to the Ravonia trial. I became very close friends with Dennis. He introduced me to all the lawyers who would do the law cases for the African National Congress of Mandela. I got to meet all of them who were great, wonderful people. Benji Pogren, one of the courageous newspaper people of South Africa, got to know him well. So there were a Kaleki Sello, the African National Congress representative in Lesotho, is a very close friend of mine. Phyllis Naidu, who's back in South Africa now, came from the famous Naidu family, a long history of fighting apartheid. Phyllis is a close friend and often had many suppers and lunches with her. I stay in touch with her all these years. Those relationships are terribly important in my life, and it was because of Peace Corps I got to know all those wonderful people. They had respect for Peace Corps. They knew what we were doing and liked it a lot. Peace Corps has an unusual ability to win friends, some close and some far, but the far are just as valuable as those who are close to it.
Mm-hmm. If you were talking to someone who was thinking about joining the Peace Corps today, what would you tell them are the real reasons to do it?
I think one is I'd advise practically anybody who wanted to join Peace Corps, they should consider it, because they give it themselves. It's a 2-year commitment, which is a pretty good sized commitment. They get to see another people so that they can review their own people as opposed to who they're working for in wherever they are in the third world. They get a view to see their own country better. They get to see a new country very well. I think all in all, they get to mix with other volunteers, which is very valuable, because there's a hell of a lot of nice people in Peace Corps. They're really good folk. So the relationship amongst themselves, as well as they get to change their view or, look back at their country maybe in a different way after they learn things, and then also get to see new friends in whatever country they go to. I'd say I hope they go with an inner sense of confidence, because you're on your own. You're by yourself usually. You got to have some guts. You got to have some, you got to be able to travel and move and train up and learn how to, live in another place. That's just not easy to do. But if they're willing to do all that, they'll probably have the best 2 years of their life.
I'll stop first. Okay. All right. Well, now you're working with after Amnesty International. You founded if you just talk about after Amnesty, I founded Human Rights Action. Sure. And trying to free the lady. After
I left Amnesty International in 1974, I decided to set myself up as a one-person human rights group. I felt with the right funding, if I could get that I could be equal to a sort of a middle human rights group with a lot of money. And I could do that on my own with a heck of a lot less money and produce and do, what sort of a middle strength human rights group could do. I could do it on my own with the new technology of the computer, video camera, and the way communication was going. So I set out to really be by myself in my basement as a one-person human rights group. One of the goals I chose was to help Aung San Suu Kyi. I'd met her husband, Michael Harris, in Boston in 1990, maybe 91. Promised my help to him. And then after I left Amnesty, one of the first trips I took was to Burma. I actually got in the country, pretended I was an antique dealer on the street where she would visit once a week for 1 hour to give out rice to her people. I timed myself in such a way with my lady who I traveled with. She sat inside the office of the National League for Democracy, and I'd be outside pretending I was an antique dealer walking around the street. So one day she did pop in there, and I saw it. She came to my lady inside and said, "Would you like to meet Jack?" And she said, "Sure." So I came in, I spent 20 minutes, half hour with her, and I promised my support again. So since then I worked with Chef Ferry to do the iconic poster that he did of her, and has become the iconic figure of her in the world now. I did an album of the best bands in the world. I did a a 1 hour documentary, put all our political support, musical support, everybody all in one place, so it would be all in one place where you could go and get that. Then we did a 30-day campaign doing little films by the talent of Los Angeles. So I went out and garnered their support, and we did 30 different small movies about her from many different ways and creative ways. Those 30 spots have now taken over 20 million hits, and probably the most successful campaign probably ever in a nonprofit with that much talent. We had writers, producers, directors, sound people. It was beautiful, and we had across the board 30 different celebrities in each one of them, magnificently done, from actors from all over the world. They've done very well. Also did, we've sent people over to the border to visit the refugee camps. I visited them as well. So we try to support the people in the refugee camps on the Thai border as well as the Bangladesh border. We do things, so we work with the exiled government to support them. We do events regularly on her birthday. So we campaign all the time for Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's one of the things I've been doing in my center. I also have asked governments, all the governments of the world, to print the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in their passports so that we all who got a passport would know our rights. And so when we traveled, we'd actually know what they are. We could be standing in Heathrow or Dulles Airport, and everybody from all over the world would be reading what their rights were. I think it'd be a great moment. Those are the kinds of things I do at my center.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about your Peace Corps experience and thoughts on the Peace Corps? And I'll ask you one question. I was surprised that recently ABC Frontline had a segment on the Peace Corps, and in the last 10 years, 1,000 women who served in the Peace Corps, volunteers, have been molested, raped, or murdered. And the Peace Corps was not saying anything about it, and then Frontline got 8 of them on television, all there, and then Peace Corps, said, "Oh yes, well, and began to open up about the issue." And it kind of reminded me, I think, of a story you told back when you were a monk, that the bishop said, "Jack, I think I'm going to like you because you were willing to protest a Catholic organization that wasn't really living by the rules they espoused." And I was surprised that the Peace Corps was not more open about the risk and about the fact that this does happen, and you do go into countries that are terribly misogynistic, but Frontline had to knock the doors down before they would even acknowledge it was an issue. So you may not want to be on camera answering that question, but it seems sort of strange to me.
No, I mean, I think within Peace Corps, along with every other organization in the world, the raising of the consciousness about women, protection of women, all the things that go with true equality and true protection of everybody. I think all of us need our consciousness raised. I never got anything in Peace Corps Lesotho of that nature to me or to my staff that I know of, but I hope we would have been sensitive to it. I'm not sure we would have been. I'd like to say I would now and pretend I would, but I don't think our consciousness was not that high. So I think I could have had my consciousness raised too. But since it didn't come to me, I can't say that one way or another. But I think in general, the nature of the crime, a lot of consciousness raising from women to raise that issue. So I have some sympathy that it must have occurred in my country. And and I'd hoped I'd do well, but I'm not sure because maybe they wouldn't want to come to me. I'd be seen too much of a male or whatever. However those things go, I think that kind of consciousness raising is necessary in Peace Corps, and I know from Faith Merrick, our nurse, who was in Tonga when there was a murder of a long story in the Peace Corps, where the Peace Corps volunteer got off because of the laws in that island, got back to the United States and was not tried for murder. So I think there's, the dealing internationally on these difficult issues of violence, we all needed our consciousness raised, and I think I'm glad Peace Corps got bumped hard. I'm sure the women were right, and I would have probably needed it too. Yeah.